Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the
We Got It podcast,
which is an official podcast of Spartans Illustrated, which is your home for all things Spartans athletics. And one of their sponsors is Nudge Printing. You don't know what that is. You don't need to look any further than our incredible t-shirts that we've got on today. Sweet gift from Spartans Illustrated and David Harns over there. But they have just like incredible shirts. And, I feel like sometimes I can get a little picky about brands. And I have been so impressed with the quality of these shirts. I love the logos. Gruff Sparty's my favorite, clearly. Matt Sheehan was also spotted at the Minnesota game this week.
True.
Rocking another Nudge Printing, like sweet retro Sparty. Sitting right behind Robbie Hummel, behind the announcer's desk. It was very fun to see.
And I know for me, like, I love having Spartan gear. And sometimes some of the main kind of producers like Nike, some of their stuff can be kind of bland, not basic. Super exciting. But yeah, Nudge Printing has all the throwback logos. They have some unique designs. So if you're looking to get some more Spartan gear, I know I always love getting a new shirt for March of Madness. So if you're looking to get that new shirt to support the Spartans, check out Nudge Printing. They have plenty of options.
And I don't think we've shared it before, but you have this sick Carhartt sweatshirt that they have, like a little gruff Sparty. So if you spot him wearing that, quite literally, you live in that sweatshirt.
I do.
Like 90% of the time. So anyway, thanks for tuning in this week. Thanks for putting up with us plugging some awesome Spartan brands that are really invested. At Michigan State, they talk so much about the family environment, and I think that carries over just to how everybody interacts with each other. And like, it was so fun having Anthony Garber on last week. It's kind of wild. Like, in my mind, the only people listening to this podcast are just like my parents and my sister and my one friend, Alyssa. And it's wild meeting people who are like, oh yeah, I like listen to you guys every Wednesday. And it was just fun hearing that from Anthony. And so yeah, we just want to, like we said, continue to get this podcast out to more Spartan fans. I think we're doing something pretty cool here.
Yeah. And in order to do that, continue to support us. Obviously, listening to us is awesome. But if you guys could follow us on Spotify and YouTube, give us a rating, interact with us on social media. All of that helps kind of build our exposure to get this out to more and more Spartan fans. That's really ultimately our goal, is just to be able to be a resource for Spartan fans to make sure they got Spartan athletics covered. So thanks for the support.
Welcome to the We Got It podcast,
a Michigan State sports podcast for everyone.
We're Jonah and Abby, a husband and wife who's probably a little too obsessed with Spartan sports.
And we want to share a little bit of that obsession with you, from casual fans
to die-hard bleed green fanatics.
And we want to make following Spartan sports easy, enjoyable, and engaging for everyone.
Go green!
Well, it's a little bit of a different tune this week as we were recording. It's been an unbelievable run, not just for men's basketball, but for all of Spartan athletics. And this weekend wasn't the best, but you can't win every single game across all sports all the time.
Yeah.
But for the men's basketball team, there were two games this week, on Tuesday night at home against Minnesota, and then on Saturday at USC. But to start us off, let's start maybe on a little bit of a positive tune. Let's kind of talk about that Minnesota game, because that was a fun game for the Spartans and a really good showing from them.
Defensively, especially. I mean, that was just it was a clinic. It was a defensive clinic for anybody tuning in.
Right.
And one of the things that I love the most about this team, and specifically about Tom Izzo, is that you're never going to see Tom really ever get like super pumped up about hitting a three, or even like making a nice little floater, or much of anything on the offensive end, if we're being quite honest. And I can't remember what the exact moment, but we got a pretty impressive stop. There were multiple times where we forced Minnesota to essentially like throw the ball away out of bounds. And I think it was maybe the third or fourth time that happened. And you just see Tom, I think they called the timeout right after that, just do this massive fist pump. And you will only ever see Tom fist pumping for a defensive effort. And that was just the whole Minnesota game.
And it just felt, I know I've said this a lot throughout the season, but like that game is a microcosm of what Tom Izzo wants of his basketball team. Defend, rebound, run. And that's what they were doing, especially in that first half. Just, I think Minnesota didn't have their first field goal until like 9 minutes left in the first half. They were just absolutely dominating Minnesota defensively. They couldn't get anything going. Even Michigan State didn't get the best start offensively, but they were able to kind of get out to a big lead and really held that throughout the game, in a game where Minnesota was playing pretty good basketball as they had won 3 in a row with ranked wins over Michigan and Oregon. A lot different team, like we said last week, from when we saw them in December. So to come out and really just suffocate them from the get-go was a great sign to see. And that defensive focus, that energy, we're going to need to see more and more of that as we get into February.
Absolutely. And I think we talked about, Minnesota, one of the biggest things that you're going to see, especially in Big Ten play, is just the level of guard play that they have. I think part of the reason that we were able to be so effective on defense is just Minnesota is not fronting like top guards in the country. They're not the biggest guys. They're not the fastest guys. And I think we saw that then come back to bite us against USC on Saturday.
Yeah. I think, too, just going to the Minnesota game a little bit more, it was just a by committee.
Yes. Scoring offensive effort. Yes.
For that game where Richardson came off the bench, had a good game. Cohen Carr, Xavier Booker.
This is sounding very similar to last week's episode.
Trey Holloman. Yes. He was leading scorer with 12 points. He scored all of those points in the first half.
And all of those points off of 3-point.
Yes. But he scored 9 of those points, 3 of those 3-pointers, in a span of 53 seconds. He nearly blew the roof off of the Breslin Center in under a minute.
Back to back to back.
He was feeling it. And that was just a fun performance to see. They improved to 9-0 in Big Ten play, just especially to end that January undefeated. First time a Tom Izzo team has ever been undefeated in December and January for a season. And obviously, maybe the top level competition hasn't been there, but still, with how many losses some of these other teams in the Big Ten have already stacked up,
it just sets us up so well for the rest of the season.
Exactly.
So that we can take a couple of losses, as much as we don't want to. We can take a couple of losses in this second half of the season, this second stretch, and not feel it the way that other teams are going to feel losses in February.
Exactly. Yeah, because now, after this Minnesota game, it's really the second half of Big Ten play with 10 games remaining.
Well, 11 counting the USC game.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Michigan State's still in a good position. Obviously now kind of transitioning to Saturday's game against USC.
I have thoughts.
Yeah, there's definitely thoughts for the game. Michigan State obviously dropped their first Big Ten game of the season, 70-64 in LA against USC. I was kind of saying before this trip, like, this USC game isn't necessarily the game you want to drop.
Right.
Because now there's just a lot more pressure on this UCLA game. You don't want to go 0-2, because if you go 0-2, then you're tied with Purdue. And then you got to just be, the margin for error is just basically gone.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the race for the Big Ten title.
Absolutely. And we still have to play Purdue.
Yeah.
We still have to play Michigan, who's 3 games back. Like, these are things that, like you said, that margin starts to go.
Yeah.
Now, it's very easy when, I think especially we've been on a wagon where we've just been cruising along, and it's been pretty easy to talk about all the good things about this team. It's really easy to then, when we have a loss, to jump to all the things that we are doing wrong. And we are going to break down, I think, kind of 3 main things that we want to highlight from the USC game that going into the rest of the play in February, we really, I think, are going to have to address. But there are still so many things that we are doing well. Overall, defense has been locked down. Against USC, I can't count the number of times that they drained threes when they had 1, if not 2, hands in their face.
Yeah, as the shot clock was expiring.
Absolutely. Like, there are going to be times, and maybe this will kind of lead us into our first topic that we want to cover, that they were able to just hit big threes in big moments. Now, and no one is unfamiliar with the fact that this year of Spartan men's basketball has not been a great 3-point shooting team. Overall, like beginning of the season, our percentage was atrocious. I think it was like down to 12% at one point, or from like a single game. I think we had like 12% shooting from three. It has been improving. A lot of times it's a lot better than I actually feel like it is during the game. I'll look it up and we're in the mid 30s or low 30s, which isn't atypical. Overall on the season, we're shooting 29% from three, which is not great. I want to say that it's around like 350th in the country.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not great. However, I think the bigger issue is that we are not even taking many threes, and we are not a team that other teams are going to perceive as good 3-point shooters.
Right.
So can you talk us through, like, what then do you feel like that impact has on offense overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really great example of it is how you really saw USC defending Michigan State on Saturday. I know at one point in the broadcast, the announcers were like, wait, is USC playing a zone?
I said that to you too.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
And because they were really playing a condensed man-to-man defense where they were kind of giving Michigan State the perimeter and kind of tempting them or baiting them, if you're going to have to hit threes in order to beat us. Yeah. And Michigan State really didn't. I think, again, they didn't shoot bad from three, but I think they only shot maybe 12 on the game versus most times teams are shooting over 20 against Michigan State.
If not close to 30.
And I don't think Michigan State needs to shoot that much.
Correct.
But Izzo continues to say that this team, he believes, is a good shooting team, that he has good shooters on the team. And the best way to kind of remedy these struggles that they've had from the three-point arc is to shoot more threes.
Yes.
And it just seems like they've kind of just accepted this fact about them, that they're not going to be a great three-point shooting team. But now USC, whether we really like it or not, kind of gave the rest of the Big Ten a blueprint on how to beat the Spartans. And as you clog the paint, kind of force them to shoot threes, and Michigan State just chose really not to take that opportunity and look for those shots. I think they really just need to try to scheme and try to look for more open shots, because you have to make these defenses play you honestly. Like, they can't just kind of try to take away one aspect of the game. They have to be worried about both.
Yes.
Otherwise, forcing Michigan State to be one-dimensional and then focusing all your efforts defensively on that is going to make it hard for Michigan State. And that was one of Michigan State's lowest scoring outputs of the whole entire season. I know Michigan State is 17-0 this year, and they scored 70 or more points.
Yeah.
And they're 1-3 when they score under 70 points. Only one was, I think, a 69-62 victory against Ohio State.
Yeah.
But that kind of 70-point threshold is kind of key for Michigan State. And you're not going to
get there unless you are making 3-point shots and or consistently getting to the line and hitting your free throws, which is something we're also going to circle back to. I am going to argue a little bit of like a glass half full perspective of, I don't know that it's necessarily that the team has accepted that they're not good 3-point shooters, but why fix what's not broken? They have been dominating in the paint up until this USC games. I mean, there's been times where we're putting up 40, 50 points from the paint.
Right.
And so I think in that sense, it's like there's been no team that can stop them there until, like you said, now USC has sort of given this blueprint. And this is where I'm saying, I'm not saying that our 3-point shooting has to magically turn around, but we need to start developing it to a sense that teams are going to start being threatened by it and can't just use that blueprint from USC.
Right. And absolutely, like, it makes sense that Michigan State has continued with the same formula throughout so far, because they've been continuing to win.
Yeah.
But now that teams have been able to try to figure out Michigan State a little bit, now it's time to Michigan State, okay, how do we adjust now that this kind of formula is out there against us to counteract that? That way they're not just contesting the paint and forcing Michigan State into taking shots that on Saturday they just weren't really taking.
I think one last point that I want to make about 3-point percentage is, if for those of you who tuned into last week's episode with Anthony Garbert, he took us through everything about like tempo-free statistics and predictive analytics, which is, mainly powered by the two sites, Ken Pomeroy and Bart Torvik. If I sound like I'm speaking Greek to you right now, please go back and listen to last week's episode. I believe the segment starts at about 28 minutes and 50 seconds. Anthony laid it out so beautifully of something that I've always kind of been intimidated by. And he really talked about, and this is something we talked about with Carter Elliott as well, that, the teams who win the national championship are teams who perform in the top 25 for offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. So Anthony really kind of talked us through overall like offensive, defensive efficiency, but then he also went through 4 factors that are really key to creating that.
Yeah.
One of those is called effective field goal percentage. So it's different than just pure field goal percentage, which would be making 2s and 3s from the field, from the court.
Yeah.
Effective is actually weighted a little bit more to favor 3-point shots. If you think about the kind of momentum that comes from these games, you saw it from USC, like their ability to knock down 3s when the shot clock's expiring, when they've got a hand in their face, like that spurs so much more momentum than a nice little floater does. Like, I'm just being honest about that. And if you look at Michigan State's effective field goal percentage, they're at 51.8% compared to their pure 2-point percentage, which is at 55.8. So that pure 2-point percentage is at 38th in the country. Our 3-point shooting is at 346th in the country. So then if you weight those the way that they do, this is specifically from Bart Torvik, that puts our effective field goal percentage at 129th in the country.
Yeah.
Which is saying a lot about the rest of our offense because we are still in an adjusted top 25 offensive. Even after that USC game, I think we're sitting at like 17 on Ken Pomeroy overall. We got to help. Like, that's what I'm saying is like the numbers are telling us that our 3-point percentage needs to improve. Even like, I know we're all feeling that as fans, but like the numbers are telling us that as well.
And the reason that they're still able to have that top 20 offense despite that effective field goal percentage being so low is their offensive rebounding percentage and their free throw
shooting, which our free throw shooting is 5th in the country right now. You wouldn't know it after the USC game because we hit 50% of our free throws, which I'm pretty sure was the scoring difference in the game.
Yeah.
And that's not the first time we've said it. It's just been the only time that it's been on the negative side for us.
Right. And if you look at this game, like, this is by no means the sky is falling kind of game. Michigan State, I don't think necessarily played bad.
No.
Didn't play, obviously, very good. And on the road, like, that's the difference. If you look at the box score for Michigan State, both teams shot very similar from the field. Rebounding was pretty identical. Turnovers was pretty identical. The difference was, I think,
the USC way that USC is getting their points
made 5 or 6 more free throws, and they made, I think, 3 more threes. And that's the difference in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't that USC got a lot more shots. Like, literally, attempts, percentage, turnovers, rebounds were all pretty much identical. It was just those 2 factors. USC knocking down more threes and more free throws was the difference in this game.
Yeah. The last of the 3 factors that I kind of want to argue is something that we talked about at the beginning of the new year, coming off of that little bit dicey victory against Western Michigan, was how many times can we realistically start the game down 10, 15 points halfway through the first half and recover? We saw that we were able to do that against the Niagaras, the Monmouths, the Western Michigans, and we were able to dig ourselves out of that hole. But you have to think about how many defensive stops you have to get and produce on the offensive side of the court to be able to dig yourself out of that hole. And I remember saying, we can go back and find the clip, like, we cannot continue to do that going into Big Ten play, and certainly not Big Ten play on the road.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what you saw happen in the USC game. We were down, I believe, 15 points, almost 10 minutes into the first half. And there were several times that the Spartans were able to pull within 3. But you cannot overcome that kind of a deficit on the road against a Big Ten team. And those are the things that come March, I think, not being able to hit threes in big moments to be able to swing that momentum and getting down early, that are just going to be factors that you're not making it to the next round. Right. That will end a March run. And so I think these are things that we hope to see as we head in the game against UCLA. I know it's going to be a little bit tougher to prep for these teams on the road. It's not like we're able to go home in between USC, UCLA, get in our normal practice gym, get in our normal routine. Like, these are not things that you can work out after UCLA. These are things that we got to start working out today and hopefully come Tuesday against UCLA and then carry it into the rest of the season.
Right. And I think for Michigan State, getting off to that big deficit. The end of the first half, they kind of did exactly what they needed to do to get back in the game. And it's going to sound super simple or maybe super obvious, but you have to get buckets and get stops. And they were able to do that those last 10 minutes of the second half to be down only 3 going into halftime. And then starting the second half, they were getting buckets, but it seemed like every time Michigan State got a score, they weren't able to get a stop on the other end of the court. And that's what just stifles because Michigan State wasn't going to stay hot the whole second half from the offensive side. They had to string those stops together, and they just never were able to do that in the second half. And that's why the whole lead was like 6 to 10 points, really, that whole second half for USC without Michigan State really having that many opportunities to kind of get within one possession or to tie the game.
Absolutely. And I think that's the tough thing too, of not only being down 15, but being down 15 that late in the first half. We got some excellent momentum going. I think we kept USC on like a 3 or 4 minute scoring drought. I think we went on like a 9-0 run at one point. But then you hit halftime and your momentum's gone, right? You're coming out to an invigorated USC team. You're coming out to an invigorated Trojans crowd, even though a lot of that crowd was made up of Michigan State fans. Like, it's just so hard to continue that momentum from the first to the second half. And ultimately, that was kind of the Spartans' demise this week.
Yeah. And ultimately, it was a matter of time before Michigan State lost a game. I'm glad that it's February 1st when they lost that game. They have a lot of time to adjust and figure it out. But that, I think, to me, this is always going to be the key part of the season, is how do they follow up with that loss?
Yes.
Do they continue to kind of spiral a little bit? I know Michigan State under Tom Izzo's only started 9-0 in Big Ten play 3 times. 2010 and 2019 were both Final Four years, and then this year. In both those years, they started 9-0 and then lost 3 straight games.
Interesting.
So obviously, and though both those seasons,
it's easy then for that loss to really take you down.
They were able to adjust and win Big Ten championships and Final Fours in both of those seasons. Obviously, hoping Michigan State doesn't drop 3 in a row, but
let's not continue that part of the pattern, please.
This is the time where Michigan State, teams are starting to kind of get some answers to what we're doing on the court. How do we adjust? How do we improve? How do we give different looks? Make teams guesses so they can't just use the same formula that USC used, and really held Michigan State to one of their worst offensive performances of the year.
Yeah, definitely. And I did just think, we talked more about all of these offensive things that we need to do, but I do think there is one thing that we've talked about previously on defense that we need to continue to clean up. And I don't know what the missing link is for this, but we saw against Illinois, we saw against Rutgers, and unfortunately it came back to bite us again against USC, is just getting absolutely beat backdoor. And you and I were even just like discussing it at length this morning. We were even like watching back clips from the second half to be like, what was the factor that we just kept getting beat? And it wasn't even that we were double teaming, guys on the perimeter or losing our man. It was purely like getting beat by USC's guards. And I think that's something that, like I said, with Minnesota, they're not the fastest. They're not the biggest guys. And, we saw countless times Carson Cooper, Jackson Kohler just being on their man, and they got to step on them, and it's a quick bucket for USC.
And especially when you're trying to come back, it's one thing to allow hard contested buckets. Like there's nothing you can do about that. Like we said, USC probably had 4 or 5 threes that were highly contested, shot clocks running out. Like, you just have to put your head down and go down the court after that. But when you're trying to make that comeback and you just give up easy buckets, points, that just kills all the momentum.
Yes, wide open path to the basket.
Right, and you just can't allow that. And that's something I think, again, we're kind of starting to see a pattern where this is maybe a little bit of a weakness. And teams, again, seeing this as a weakness, are going to try to exploit that. So how does Michigan State adjust? How do they kind of counteract that to kind of take away that part of a game from an opponent's offense.
And, really USC presented a big challenge in that they did have such great perimeter shooting. And so you want to be close up on your man to try to keep a hand in their face as much as you can, which when they are bigger and faster, it's a lot easier then for them to get a step on you because your back's to the basket to be able to just drive straight to the hoop. But at the same time, like, what is that missing link and factor? And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when we were chatting about it this morning, is just not being fully locked in and getting caught ball watching. And that's one thing that, you could maybe look at it again one way or the other. On the one hand, we have such a great rotation that you constantly have fresh guys coming in. And so you hope that will keep that sort of like intensity, energy on defense. By the same coin, on the other side, I can see how it hurts us in a way, because then you're constantly like trying to figure out these matchups. And maybe, Booker was keeping a great read on, whoever it is that he's guarding. And then all of a sudden you bring Jackson Kohler in and he doesn't quite have the same like step on that guy. Like those are those mismatches that I think just really burned us against
Right.
USC.
And that's, we've talked about how the depth has been really the strength of this team this year. And I think that will continue to be a strength. But in some of these games where there are some mismatches, I think there are times where you do kind of have to shrink the rotation a little bit. And the thing is, that can look a little bit different from game to game.
Absolutely.
But when your bench is consistently outscoring your starters, continuing to kind of bring more energy than your starters, I think maybe the conversation maybe needs to start happening. Again, not panicking. We don't need to change everything. We're still 9-1 in the Big Ten. But just kind of, you have to play to your strengths. What are the guys that are giving us the best shot at winning?
Per matchup, right? Like, it's not like, oh, we're shrinking it down to these 8 guys and Frankie and Cooper are out now. Like, it's going to be matchup dependent.
Right. So I would like to see that. I mean, obviously USC really only played 6 guys throughout this game. So you don't necessarily need that depth.
No.
You can win games. And again, obviously, with USC, they've lost 5 in the Big Ten. It's not sustainable. And that's why I think you can have different matchups, can kind of be slightly different rotations. But I think just sticking with those matchups that maybe you have advantages with in certain games is important. And it seemed like Tom maybe was a little bit too content kind of just going with his typical rotations, even though some of those were producing mismatches for USC.
Definitely. One last thing that I'll say about rotations, and we've kind of been saying this, while we've been watching games for the last few weeks, is I hate having both Jeremy Fears Jr. and Jaden Akins sitting on the bench at the same time. I trust Jay so much, and like he's such a factor when he's in there, and we've said this so many times, he does not play like a freshman. But I think when you have both Fears and Akins on the bench, you don't have really anyone with like this main leader. I talk about Fears like he's a veteran, even though he's a redshirt freshman, but he comes out there and helps that team in such a veteran way.
And both of those guys are really the catalyst to Michigan State's pace and trying to get those fast break baskets. And not that Jace and Holloman aren't those guys, but really it's Fears and Akins that really make that happen. So when you have both of those guys out, it kind of takes Michigan State's biggest strength out of the game a little bit and forces them more into the half court a little bit, which we've talked about isn't necessarily their strength as much, especially when they're not able to hit threes. And I think really you have to, as much as you can, have at least one of those guys on the court at all times.
Definitely. I'm laughing internally a little bit because before we started to record, we were like, oh, this is going to be a really short episode. Like, we finally had a loss. We don't want to talk about it very much. And here we are talking about like 6 different factors about what Michigan State needs to do. But I love it. Like, even when things aren't going like exactly how we want them to, we've talked about, we knew we were going to have a loss. We were hoping it wasn't going to be this loss in California. But there's still just like so many good things to talk about for this Michigan State team. And by no means does this mean the season is over. Exactly like you said, thinking back to 2015 and 2019, those guys went and lost 3 in a row and then were still able to recover. And so I think being able to pull out another win against UCLA on the road would be huge for this team, not only record-wise, but also just like their morale and overall feeling and attitude. But if they don't, again, the sky's not falling. We pull even with Purdue. We still got a lot of season that we can continue to prove that this Michigan State team is what I think everybody is starting to say that they are.
Yeah, and I think, too, if you want any more solace on this game is on Saturday, 8 of the top 14 teams lost. 3 of those, which at least 3, all lost at home to unranked teams who are kind of either not really in the NCAA tournament conversation or just on the fringe. So losses happen.
Yes.
This is by no means, like we said, the sky is falling. We got a long season ahead of us.
And Michigan State still has no quad 2, quad 3, or quad 4 losses.
Right.
And I'm guessing some of those at-home teams, top 25 teams that lost to unranked opponents, picked up a quad 2 or a quad 3 loss. Yeah. So when we talk about that resume going into March, Michigan State's is still looking pretty darn good.
Yeah, I think it'll just be, can they get some of those top wins coming up? Like Oregon, UCLA obviously is going to be quad 1A matchup. Oregon at home will be Purdue coming up. The Michigan games, Illinois. There's a ton of opportunities for Michigan State. We'll just kind of see what this team is made of now.
It's time now for halftime. And, we've been saying it for a while. We knew at some point the absolute steam truck, plow, whatever you want to call it, of Michigan State athletics was probably going to come to an end. And, this week it was not a total loss, but we started to see a few more of those losses creep in kind of across athletics. The Michigan State women's Spartans basketball team, unfortunately, took a defeat at the Breslin Center against Oregon. It's the first loss in Breslin all year. Mm-hmm. So it depends on how you want to look at it, like glass half empty, glass half full. Overall, it's been pretty incredible in the Breslin Center, and there was going to be a loss in the Big Ten at some point. Now, they have a chance to take on Northwestern at Northwestern. By the time you hear this episode, the result will be out for us. It's still unknown at this point. But we hope that it'll be a split for them, just like it was a split for the men's hockey team this week.
Yeah, the men's hockey team traveled down to Columbus this weekend to face number 11 Ohio State.
Yeah, nothing good happens in Ohio.
Thursday night was a rough start to the series as the Spartans dropped the game 4-2, but they were able to get back in the win column on Friday to win 4-1 against Ohio State to split the series, get the 3 points. Still have a pretty substantial lead in the Big Ten standings. The bummer news this week for Michigan State hockey is the loss of Captain Red Savage, who will be out for the season for the Spartans. So decent bit to overcome there, but Michigan State still is in a great position, both in the Big Ten and nationally, as we kind of hit the stretch around the season.
Definitely. And the men's basketball team was not the only one to make a trip out to LA this week. The women's gymnastics team took on UCLA. And for those of you who don't know, they have the absolute GOAT of floor routines, Miss Jordan Childs herself, on UCLA. And they made it a tight competition heading into the last rotation with the Spartans on beam, with UCLA on floor routine. And so I think they had 4 gymnasts on floor routine. 2 of them got near perfect scores. I think like 9.975 for 2 of the floor routines. And then, of course, Miss Jordan Childs closed it out with a perfect 10, which just squeezed UCLA past the Spartans. Honestly, and maybe this is bad, I just felt like going into that, we were probably going to get blown out. So the fact that, your women's Spartans were able to keep it such a close race with one of the best gymnasts in the world is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and I mean, they needed a perfect 10 really from Childs to be able to win the match, and they got that perfect 10.
That's really the only reason why they surpassed the Spartans.
Yeah. But overall, a good performance from
absolutely
the Spartans traveling to LA, and they're a fun team to watch. It was the first time that Fox has ever broadcasted a college gymnastics meet. So
which again, glass half full, glass half empty sort of situation.
But cool that,
so cool that, women's sports, and especially like a sport that is not one of the main ones that you think of, is getting some traction. And I love that the Olympics is bringing that kind of exposure to some of these quote unquote smaller sports, because they're so incredible to watch. I mean, just you and I, we were able to catch that last rotation, and multiple times we were just like exclaiming, jaws on the ground at what these gymnasts are doing.
Yeah, and the environment is insane.
Wild.
Like, it's just
so different than the Olympic environment. I mean, they had confetti. They had, every person in the crowd is like doing the dances along with the floor routine. Like, just so fun to tune in. Even though it was for UCLA, it was really fun to watch.
Absolutely.
Well, Jonah, for this week's We Got It Covered segment, I have a few questions about the restricted area and about just like offensive fouls in general, which those two things, to my understanding, sometimes kind of go hand in hand and affect whether something is like a defensive or an offensive foul. Now, for this We Got It Covered segment, we always try to like dive into some niche aspect or weird rule or even just like a term that you might hear used by announcers during the game, and really help break it down for fans of all levels or all, backgrounds, to really help them like understand the game and kind of know like, why was that just an offensive call? It looked like our guy got absolutely undercut and fell on the ground and hurt himself. So why don't you walk us through a little bit? You can pick where you want to start. Like, talking about offensive fouls in the restricted area.
Right. And again, there's some good examples of this in the USC game on Saturday, where there's some offensive fouls / defensive fouls that got kind of called in big moments. I know one in the first half, there was one on a Cohen Carr on a dunk he had that would have, I think it made it a 1-point game. There was a moment early in the second half, Michigan State kind of had momentum on Zapala. And both of those were called obviously offensive fouls that kind of prevented some buckets and big moments that would have maybe kind of helped that momentum continue to build. So to start off, a charge is a specific kind of offensive foul.
Okay.
So we talked about a couple weeks ago, kind of the moving screens, moving picks. Those are obviously in the realm of offensive fouls that are different from charges. So a charge is essentially when a offensive player, whether they have the ball or not, kind of comes into kind of that excessive contact with the defender when they're in legal defensive position.
Okay.
So that kind of key legal defensive position is kind of the linchpin of whether or not something's going to be called a charge or a blocking foul on the defense. And this is actually something that has changed in recent years, which might be kind of adding a little bit to the confusion on maybe plays where you say, hey, no, he was set. That should have been a charge or vice versa. So in previous, legal guarding position was the defender had to be planted in a defensive position prior to the offensive player, especially when they're going to the basket, before they were in the air, kind of going up for the shot.
Okay.
But now that is switched, where the defender has to be in legal guarding position kind of prior to when the offensive player kind of plants his leg to get airborne.
Okay.
So it makes a kind of more on the defense, and that's kind of maybe why we've seen less charges overall this year, is because that defender kind of has to be in position earlier than when they were previously.
Which, if you think back to also our segment on the cylinder rule, which we're going quite a few episodes back, I think back into like November, that does make sense, because we talked about a lot of like defensive fouls as far as like restricting the offensive player's cylinder, right? You think about from the ceiling of the basketball court down to their feet. A defensive play can't impinge on that cylinder and restrict the player's movement. But if you're already in position, then at that point, the offensive player, they're the ones impinging on the defensive player's cylinder, if you want to think about it that way.
And the reason they had kind of this change to make it harder for defenders is, I mean, it's kind of simple, but NCAA wants basketball to be exciting.
Yeah.
And probably the most exciting aspect of basketball is scoring.
Yeah.
So usually, and you kind of see this throughout all sports, is usually the offensive team kind of has the advantage when it comes to these penalties or these fouls to kind of help them to kind of increase scoring and to not kind of prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
So for a charging foul, like I said, that defender has to be in place prior to that offensive player kind of planting their leg to become airborne.
Okay.
Now, there's kind of another aspect of that, especially when it comes to around the basket.
Okay. When you're like actually going towards making a layup.
Right. Because you could see charges kind of on the perimeter when a guy isn't necessarily shooting. A lot of that times you're going to see it's because the offensive player maybe extended their arm,
lowered a shoulder,
stuff like that.
When the defensive player was clearly established in that space. Again, it's the offensive player then impinging on the defensive player's cylinder.
Or you'll see more kind of when somebody who doesn't have the ball kind of just blows right into a defender.
Which would be like an off-ball offensive foul. Yeah.
But you probably noticed that they're underneath the basket, and you might know what this is, might know what it is. There's this kind of arc that goes around the basket that extends 3 feet from the cylinder. And that is called the restricted arc.
Okay.
So in order for a defender to draw a charge, that defender has to be outside of that restricted arc.
Okay.
So going to the example of Zapala kind of early in the second half, you saw that there was USC defender in the restricted arc, and as Zapala was kind of driving to the lane, and you very intentional stepped outside of the restrictor. I mean, his heels were like on the line pretty much in order to get that charge call. Because if he would have stayed a half foot into that restricted arc, even if he was in legal guarding position as far as being planted kind of prior to Zapala,
he would not have drawn the charge, and it would have been a blocking foul.
Right.
Every time, right?
Every
if you
time.
are in the arc, you are then getting the blocking foul.
And that's basically
foul level contact made.
Yes.
Okay.
To, again, kind of prevent the defense from just kind of sitting somebody right underneath the basket and preventing anybody from getting to the hoop.
And, maybe the more diplomatic way that the NCAA would want us to think about is that they're trying to prevent player injuries as well.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're trying to prevent people from trying to get there right in the last minute where the player is already kind of in the air. And then it gets a lot harder too, I think, for referees to call and judge, was the defender there before the player was in the air? Now there's kind of no question about it. If the player is planted, that's the point where you can start calling a charge.
Right.
Absolutely.
And two, it makes it easy for the officials because you have that restricted arc. If he's in the arc, there's no real question on how you call that play. Obviously, if he's outside of the arc, you still kind of have to determine if he was in legal position prior to the offensive player planting their leg. But the arc does overall make it easier for officials to kind of differentiate whether or not something should be a charge or a block. But some of those new rules with the planted leg versus airborne is kind of why you've seen the decrease in charges maybe this year, even though there were some examples of Michigan State getting called for those charges.
So you're telling me that if I'm sitting on my couch and I'm yelling about, that should have been a charge because our guy was there beforehand and I'm ticked that we just got a blocking foul, but I see that his feet are on that restricted arch or he's within that restricted arch, that's telling me that I need to cool it.
I think there was an example of that in the Rutgers game that we actually rewound and watched again. Because initially, kind of live, it looked very much like a charge. But when you kind of look, I forget who it was on Michigan State, they weren't quite planted prior to that Rutgers player planting their leg. And that's why it was a blocking foul and not a charge.
Man, it's a lot to keep up with in the moment. And thank goodness for being able to rewind and figure things out. And that just helps me kind of understand it, because it does seem like there has been, just like anecdotally, a decrease in the number of charges that get called, which when we're on offense, great, I love it. But defensively, it feels like, man, they're just like any contact ends up being a block. And so it really makes you think about how we're positioning ourselves on defense as well.
Absolutely. But next time you see a charge or a block called, I know most of us probably have access to be able to rewind. If you don't agree with the call, initially go back, watch. Maybe you were not quite seeing it.
Or maybe the refs
weren't quite seeing it. Yes, but go back. It's kind of fun to kind of see how these rules actually play out.
Jeez, we haven't given our homework or our listeners any homework since like football season. So we're giving you some homework again from this.
Yeah, we got 2 opportunities this week for the men's basketball team. So enjoy that homework. Hopefully that was a little bit more helpful. I'm understanding kind of the change in the charge, foul, and now to the restricted arc and kind of how that affects plays as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that closes out today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in. As always, go green.
Go white. Go state.